Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an AO7 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com. The primary fermentable used to make beer is barley malt, which not only possesses starches, but the enzymes required to break those starches down into sugars yeast can ferment. While barley offers a variety of wonderful flavor options, it's not the only grain that can be used to make beer. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this episode, I'm joined by contributor Steve Thanos to chat about the impact brewing with Flaked Rye has on beer, particularly when used in an American pale ale.
Rye is one of my favorite ingredients, so it'll be interesting to talk about flaked rye and kind of compare that to what we know of rye malt, and I look forward to discussing this with you.
Yeah, we've talked about rye a few times on this show. In fact, rye malt was the focus of episode 78, and we hit on a short and shoddy rye IPA in episode 255. Now, I've used rye quite a bit over the years, and I've developed some pretty strong opinions that I'm sure we're going to get into later on, but I've never actually used flaked rye. I'm looking forward to going over how it differs from rye malt, hearing your experiences using it, Steve, and chatting about a cool experiment you performed on the topic. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. This month's guest is one of the best homebrewers I know, the 2022 Oregon State Homebrewer of the Year and newest contributor to Brewlosophy, Jordan Folks. Jordan's one of those guys who tends to stick to traditional brewing methods, which has worked out really well for him as he's won a ton of awards, but he's also quite open-minded and really loves experimenting with brewing and beer, which is why we're so excited to have him on board. This is going to be a really great session with an equally great person to be a part of it. You have to make your pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, January 20th, 2023, as Jordan's going to be taking questions on Saturday the 21st. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate it. I recently had a look at our stats and saw that over half of our monthly downloads come from iPhone users, which, using some simple math, indicates that there's well over 6,000 of you who have yet to rate and review our show. Come on! If you're one of these people, do us a solid and spend a minute pecking at your phone. We really do take your comments to heart. Big cheers to everybody who has already done this. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who, in addition to having a remarkable YouTube channel chock full of great brewing-related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best electric brewing systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120-volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240-volt 10-gallon system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Listener Jonah Waters wrote in with feedback after listening to us talk about our experiences with bulk ingredients. Jonah said, I wanted to add my 2 cents on the discussion about buying grains in bulk. I dug into this recently and I found that generally speaking, it's not cheaper to buy in bulk if you have to get it shipped to you. I won't bore everyone with the numbers, but it comes down to the fact that a 50-pound sack of grains is not cheap to ship, at least not in Portland, Maine, and never seems to qualify for free shipping. For example, a 50-pound sack of grain from More Beer does not qualify qualify for shipping. And when you add in the shipping cost, it works out to be more expensive per pound than getting smaller 10-pound bags, which do qualify for free shipping on orders over $59, even for multiple 10-pound bags, wink, wink. The make friends with the brewer route is by far the cheapest way to go. Not only will they likely sell you a sack or add it on to their next order, they get it for significantly less than a home brewer can, like less than half the price, Jonah says. An intermediate solution, if you haven't made friends with the brewer yet, is to support your local homebrew shop if possible. I would definitely check with them on the price before ordering online.
I would definitely agree with Jonah there. The shipping has always been the one part that, it's kind of like the fine print at the end that you need to read. And it can really catch you for a loop. My suggestion definitely would be, and this is how I started before I came on board with Brewlosophy, was to get involved with groups that potentially do or could do group buys.
Yeah.
That is something that has saved me, and I still have grain that is stored nicely and without any air or anything like that from group buys that I've bought years ago, and it's still good. And so, group buys are always the way to go, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah, so group buys are awesome, and I don't think we touched too much on group buys in that episode. One thing to keep in mind with group buys is that you're still likely not going to get the price that a professional, commercial brewer is getting on their grain, but that's okay. I have to admit, after we published that episode, and I got a few emails from folks saying, "Oh, what a great idea! I'm going to hit up my local commercial brewer." I really felt bad. I did not mean to suggest that you just need, and I think Cade may have commented on it, but I did not mean to suggest, going and begging somebody you don't know, who you're not friends with, for a good deal on grain. Don't do that. If they're your buddies, definitely don't feel bad asking. My experience has been that they are perfectly fine tacking on a couple extra sacks of grain to help a friend out, whatever. But yes, I agree. Go to your local homebrew shop first. Shipping is going to kill you on 50 to 55 pound sacks of grain. Couldn't agree with you more, Jonah. And there are various routes you can go to getting a decent deal on bulk grains. In my experience, like I was saying, the best prices that I've got have been when I'm near Moorbeer, which is in the Bay Area for me. So that's a 3-hour drive from where I'm at. But if I'm going over there to see family, or if I'm going to the airport on my way home, I might stop and grab a couple of sacks. That's been a really great price. Right underneath that, and we're talking like maybe a few dollars, is my local homebrew shop with my club discount. And that really is, it's basically the same price in the end. Different offerings. They tend to get, Great Western versus what Moorbeer gets. Maybe I'll pick up some raw or something up there. But ultimately, I think the point is that going bulk can definitely save you money if you do it the right way. And Jonah makes a good point that if you're looking to go bulk and you can only have grain shipped to you, it may not be the most efficient, price wise, at least, way to go. So thank you for your feedback, Jonah. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Hey, we wanted to let our listeners know about some really cool educational opportunities coming up that we think sound really awesome. First, from March 8th through the 10th, 2023, Haas is offering their Hop Flavorist America, which is based on the Barth Haas 5-part Hop Flavorist course, the world's most comprehensive training in the flavor of hops. This 2.5-day program combines the best elements from each level and distills the theory down to the most practical applications for sensory, quality brewing professionals. Registration is just $500. You can learn more by searching Hop Flavorist America on Google, or you can email Jeff Daly directly at jeff.daily, that's DAILEY, at johnihaas.com. Another really cool event offered by our friends at Imperial Yeast in collaboration with Penn State is a course on how to choose the right yeast for your beer. The primary focus of this class is to educate people on the role that yeast plays in the brewing process, namely how it can determine the flavor profile of your beer. Topics will also include yeast management, yeast selection, and the fundamentals of fermentation. This online course will be happening on January 12th, 2023, so it's coming up in just a couple of weeks, and it is completely free to attend. The easiest way to enroll is to simply search up Imperial Yeast Penn State, and you should find it there. All right, for those of you who read the articles we publish at brewlosophy.com, you likely saw the announcement we made last week that has to do with something we've sort of been teasing here on the podcast. Well, the cat is officially out of the bag. After 9 years of publishing articles on the web and 7 years of podcasting, we are finally making the jump to YouTube. That's right, the Brewlosophy Show is coming in the first quarter of 2023, and we couldn't be more excited to announce that Martin Keene from the killer YouTube channel, The Homebrew Challenge, will be taking that over completely. This is a very, very good thing, as Martin's video skills are far superior to my own. Plus, he has a really nice accent to listen to. I just can't match that. So now this does mean that the Homebrew Challenge will be coming to an end, but a lot of what Martin will be doing on the Brewlosophy Show is going to be similar, just with a Brewlosophy spin to it. If you like watching your homebrewing content as much as you do reading or listening to it, please go subscribe to our channel now at youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy show. That's at the symbol, the Brewlosophy with a regular U show. When we're back from this break, we'll be digging into Flaked Rye. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to xchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. There is no denying that barley malt can be used to achieve various flavors in beer, which in addition to its other qualities explains its importance as a brewing ingredient. But there are certain grains that add a little something different, characteristics you just can't get from barley malt alone, and one of those is rye. Now, before we really start getting into flaked rye, let's just spend a minute going over some basics of rye, which I know we did in a recent Short and Shoddy episode, so we're going to try not to be too redundant here.
Yeah, so rye malt has a pretty interesting history, whether it be used for food such as bread or breakfast cereal, or even whiskey and beer, which is our favorite. Rye is quite versatile. It is said to add some unique flavors to food and beverages, of course. Often associated with a spiciness that people get from rye. I am under the belief that it's more earthy than spicy. I've done this before where I've taken a piece of rye bread without caraway seed, and I actually asked my wife to join me with this, and I perceived it to be very earthy and not spicy at all, where I asked her to do it, and she was like, no, it's spicy. And we've talked about this before in the Rye Saison caraway seed episode way back when. And I think it's the association that we have with rye with caraway seed. And of course, caraway seed is indeed spicy. That's how I perceive it. And so our minds automatically trick us to think that, okay, everything that we have with rye is automatically going to be spicy because we associate it with caraway. I I don't know. I can understand the thought process, but at the same time, at the end of the day, I'm not getting a whole lot of spice out of rye.
Either am I. And I was going to say, let's just get this out of the way now. And I'm glad you went there, Steve.
Yes.
you opened the door to our quote, controversial perspectives on the impact rye has on the flavor of beer and such. I love rye whiskey as well. When I drink rye whiskey, I don't taste caraway seed or spicy. I taste an earthy, almost a richness, a malty richness, or a grainy richness, I should say, as compared to, single malt barley, or, whiskeys and such like that. So yeah, we are going to get this out now. You said your wife perceives it as spicy. Maybe there is a subjective component there. I don't want to belabor this because we've already done it multiple times, but I think you and I both agree, Steve, that our experience, our subjective experience and with rye as used in brewing is that it imparts this, flavor wise at least, kind of an earthy characteristic, very, very desirable, a very nice earthy thing. And I do not get spice. I too agree that the association between rye and caraway is what kind of fools us. And that if you were to serve a rye beer to somebody and not tell them rye was in it, I'm doubtful they would describe it as being spicy. So that is that. We're going to leave it at that. Otherwise, we could spend the entire episode talking about that yet again. In terms of brewing with rye, I mean, I was doing some research, and I'm assuming that even before the 15th century, some people were making alcoholic beverages with rye. But there's evidence, documented evidence that rye beers were popular in Bavaria as early as the 15th century. Though its use significantly decreased when the Reinheitsgebot, or the beer purity law, passed in 1516. So that was the one saying basically you have to use barley. And so obviously, in order to avoid going to jail for beer or whatever it was, getting fined, people moved away from rye. But as you know, there's Rogan beer, which is made with upwards of 60% rye, typically a blend of rye malt and other forms of rye. And it's usually added to the mash with a typical usage rate, whether Rogan beer or not, a typical usage rate for rye in general is about 10 to 40%. And it imparts various other characteristics as well. You're going to get more than just the flavor thing. And that's actually what I like the most about rye. Now, we have talked about brewing with rye many times. Again, I don't want to go too far into this because we've already done it. So let's now break down the difference between malted rye and flaked rye, which we can't really do without a decent understanding of what exactly malted rye is, what it goes through, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of malted rye, I would say that it's huskless, and there's this huge issue with using it when you're brewing and not being able to lauter your wort because it's going to create a stuck sparge. That's one of the drawbacks to using rye in a high volume. However, as yourself included, Marshall, I am a brew in a bag user, so I don't really have to worry about that all that much. But I do notice, even when I'm using my bag, that there is a kind of a stickiness to it. And like even when you're squeezing the bag, you really have to put some more effort, I think, into doing that, squeezing the bag when you have rye. And it's just the way it is, and I've accepted it. And I love rye so much that it's well worth the efforts.
Yeah, it's worth the work. I agree with you. Now that is the case. The huskless thing is the case for both malted and flaked rye. There's no husk there. When you look at barley malt, for example, and you can nibble on some, you'll usually have that husk kind of what remains in your mouth a little bit afterwards. That actually helps with lautering. It helps to create this filter bed. Again, not a huge issue with certain modern types of lautering setups. So if you're using a brew in a bag or brew in a basket, that's not going to be the biggest issue, but it's absolutely something you need to consider if you're brewing with higher amounts of rye, regardless of the type. I've had stuck sparges when I was doing batch sparge with with malted rye at just 20% of the grist. So that is something you want to keep in mind. Now, malted rye goes through the same process as barley malt, the malting process, which a very simplified version of that means that it spends about 24 to 48 hours in the steeping phase, during which the grain, the raw grain, is steeped at a specific temperature and water to activate enzymes that ultimately end up stimulating the grain to create new enzymes. Enzymes are a big word when it comes to mashing and brewing beer. The next 4 to 6 days are the germination phase. This is when acrospires grow out of the rye kernels and where modification occurs. Now, modification just refers to the breakdown of starches in the endosperm. Higher modification means that more starches are available to be enzymatically converted into fermentable sugar. This is what we all, when we talk about hot malt or well maltified malt, this is what we're talking about. And then after the germination phase is kilning. The germinated rye grains are heated in a kiln, which reduces the overall moisture content and halts germination to retain those starches in the grain. It also adds various degrees of color, and which, as we know, is associated with flavor. So you can get, darker kilned rye malts, you can get lighter kilned rye malts, and all of that. It's very similar again to barley malt. Now, the cool thing about malted rye, again, very similar to barley malt, is that it has a diastatic power of over 100 degrees Lintner, which means it can be used on its own. It self-converts. So if you wanted to brew a 100% rye malt beer, I believe actually James Spencer from Basic Brewing may have done that, and I think he said it had the consistency of snot. So you might want to be careful with that. But you can get away with doing that. That's one of the beauties of my rye malt, is that it's similar to barley malt in terms of its diastatic power and its ability to self-convert. But most people, I don't think, are doing that. Again, I think the typical range of usage is about 10 to 40%. Again, like you said, Steve, this is a huskless grain, meaning that you are going to have a slower lauter if you don't take some measure. You whether that's using rice hulls, using a big portion of a husked malt like barley malt, which I think is what most people do. The other consideration is that it's very high in beta glucans, meaning you are going to get increased viscosity when you mix no husk with thicker wort. Again, this can impede your lautering, and it will contribute to a perceptibly higher body in the beer. But that is the basics of malted rye. It goes through the same process as barley malt, and with the exception of not having a husk or being a completely different cereal grain, it can be used in a similar way.
Yeah, I found it interesting researching a while back on rye and reading kegerator.com, and Nick Carr, their writer from that site, said that the whole stuck sparge and stuff like that is the quote dark side of rye, which I just found it was really interesting how he explained that, and it's definitely something that's kind of makes people shy away from it, I think, but I really think that it's well worth the effort later on, because what it contributes to a finished beer is just, in my opinion, remarkable.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you like the most about rye in general. I also want to hear more about your experience with flaked rye, which again I have no experience with, but I did do some research on it. Compared to malted rye, flaked rye is arguably a more simple product. It's basically they take the raw rye grain and they steam it, and then they squeeze it through these rollers into these flat to create these flat flakes. It looks exactly like regular oatmeal, which goes through the same exact process. It's steamed and then squeezed through these rollers, and you get these flakes. Hence the name flaked rye. It is not malted first, so it is. This is not a malted product. This is a raw rye product that again is steamed and flattened out. When you compare it to malted rye, it tends to be a little bit lighter in color, right around 2 SRM, and it has, this is the important point, it has no diastatic power. It will not self-convert, meaning that in order to use it, you have to be brewing with something with some diastatic power, whether that's another malted grain like barley malt, or it could even be malted rye that you're brewing with, but you have to do that. But it will contribute about 36 points per pound per gallon gallon when used with a diastatic malt. So it does contribute some sugars to beer, which I think is pretty cool. Again, similar to flaked barley.
Yeah, I mean, I've recently, there was a homebrew shop that was closing down, and so there was a big sale on all their specialty grains and everything. So I went in and grabbed what I wanted, and you're looking at the flaked rye and flaked oats, and you can easily get them all confused unless you're really paying attention. But the flaked barley, flaked rye, flaked oatmeal, all really kind of looks the same. Maybe a little difference in color here and there. But yeah, it's a wonderful product. In a pinch, I think it's well worth the use. And especially if you're not going to want to deal with the potential of having that stuck sparge, it's something to consider.
Yeah, well, and my understanding is that you're still going to pull all the beta glucans out of that flaked rye. And it's still huskless, so you do need to be mindful. But in my opinion, it's no different than using flaked oats or flaked barley, where that flaked adjunct just seems to create a thicker mash in general, a kind of gummier mash. So obviously nobody wants to have a stuck sparge. That's just something to be thoughtful of, regardless. Yeah. Now, when compared to rye malt, Steve, as the person who has used flaked rye, my understanding, again, we're looking 10 to 40%, upwards of 60 for Rogan beer with rye malt. Is there a change in the recommended usage rate for when you're using flaked rye instead of malted rye, or is it about the same?
I think it's about the same, to be honest with you. I've never really done the research on it, but I would think that like upwards towards like 20%, I think is usually where I keep my, whether it be flaked rye or flaked oats, right around 20% is really the max. And quite honestly, I just don't really feel like buying a bag is going to be about maybe say $2 to $4 nowadays. I don't want to have to spend that much on a specialty malt, so there's something to consider there. However, I think that if you're using like 2 pounds in a normal 5-gallon batch, it's not that bad. It's not going to break the bank. So
yeah, no. I mean, grains in general are pretty cheap, and I did a little. I did some perusing of Brewfather's recipe database for rye beers, and 20% is like the go-to for so many recipes. Yeah. That's what I started with. I made again rye malt. This is not flaked rye, but the very first rye IPA, or I think it was a pale ale I ever made, was 20% rye malt, and that definitely gives you in my opinion at least, a different flavor characteristics. So definitely. I agree. I know people can go up to, I was reading, I forget who it was, but a manufacturer of flaked rye, and they recommend upwards, up to 40% flaked rye. I'm sure you could use more if you're making a Rogan beer, which I've had Rogan beer. I'm not the biggest fan of the style, but that's for other reasons, not the rye. The neat thing about flaked grains in general, including flaked rye, is that you don't really need to mill them. Because of the way they're treated, you don't need to run them through the mill. I have a local buddy, who swears that it doesn't have any impact, and so he mills all of his grain together, including flaked grains, and he's not had any issues. I've had his beers; they're great. So, your mileage may vary there. I don't think it matters. I think what they're saying is there's no need, and because they're flat, they're not. It's not that they're going to get crushed anyways because they're already flattened. So, do you mill yours, Steve? Or
I do not mill flaked rye at all, or flaked oats for that matter. What I do want to say about a milling though with rye malt is just recently, actually, I've noticed that my numbers now are never that consistent or consistently good when I'm brewing a rye beer or a beer with a little bit of rye in it. My numbers are always lower when I have that, and if I don't double crush my rye malt. So when I start off milling my grains maybe the day before, the night before, whatever, I will purposely take my rye and mill that first, so I can then mill into a bucket, take the bucket, dump it back in, mill it once again so that I can get a more of a coarser, or I'm sorry, a finer crush on that rye malt. And when I did that, my numbers are increasingly better.
That's interesting. Again, our focus is mostly on flaked rye and how it compares to malted rye. You don't have to mill malted rye, and I think what I'm hearing you say is you don't mill your flaked rye,
correct?
But you do have to mill your malted rye. That's my bad.
Yes.
And I've noticed when using malted rye that the kernels are smaller than barley, and I believe that explains a bit why you can't get such a fine crush when using malted rye. Is that they are smaller, so they're if you run it through your mill twice, you ostensibly are going to mill more of it or crush more of that malt into a finer I guess grist.
That makes sense.
So yeah, so that makes sense to me as well. I don't think though, like my buddy Matt here locally, mills all of his flaked grains. I don't think it has much of an impact. He sent me a photo one time after doing it, and the grains looked the same. They didn't look like they were shredded or anything like that. So it's just an unnecessary step. I don't believe that it's detrimental if you choose to do it. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't think it would be. But I again, like you said, it's not going to really change much. So I like the convenience of just being able to open a bag and just dump it right in. That to me is, I like being able to get rid of that bag then, at the end and when I'm cleaning up.
Yeah. Well, so when compared to malted rye, in terms of the perceptible characteristics that flaked rye imparts to beer, this is based purely, I want to hear your anecdote. Again, I've not used flaked rye, so I cannot speak to my personal experiences with what it does to beer. But from what I read, flaked rye will contribute a milder flavor than rye malt. And if that, however you perceive that to be, whether it's spicy or earthy, whatever, and it's purported to increase body, mouthfeel, and foam retention a little bit more than rye malt. And as I was thinking about that, initially I'm going, why would that even matter? Well, look at what the claims are about flaked barley. If you use 100%, you make a beer with 100% pale malt, compared to one that's 80% pale malt and 20% flaked barley, the expectation is that the one made with flaked barley is going to have maybe a little bit more body and thicker foam, stuff like that. It's the same for rye malt, is my understanding.
Yeah, definitely. I think I put this to not necessarily to test, or at least consciously putting it to the test, but looking at a style like an English porter or an American porter, tend to be a little bit thinner in body. Still fantastic style. I love a good porter. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trashing porters at all.
I love porter.
Yeah. And I have a recipe for a rye porter. And I would venture to guess that I think I've only brewed it with rye malt. But I would think that it would add that mouthfeel and that body that you really like and you don't get necessarily with a porter just on its own. So it definitely can add that perception of a better body and more head retention, of course, for the foam. Yeah,
and that's just the whole flaked grain thing. Again, whether barley, rye, oatmeal, whatever it is, there's this belief that using flaked grains will improve your body, it will improve your head retention, and so that's there for rye as well. But it will, interestingly, again, purportedly impart a more mild flavor than if you were to use rye malt. So those are some of the big differences between rye malt and flaked rye. And these are things that you have to take into account when you're designing a recipe using either of those. I would love for, James to do a 100%, it'd be like 80% flaked rye with 20% rye malt and see how that thing turns out. I bet it'd just be pasty, super thick.
That would really be interesting.
I'm not sure. It'd probably be equally as interesting tasting as it would be to watch him brew it.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know. I have my doubts that it's going to, everything is going to turn out, the way we want it to. But I was very impressed though with my one experience of having a Rogan beer before.
You liked it?
I liked it a lot. There was a brewery in central Illinois my brother went to. I believe it's Bearded Owl, I think, in like the Peoria area. And they had a Rogan beer that they canned. And my perception of Rogan beer, even before I tried it, was I don't know if I like the yeast that they use. Traditionally, it has a lot of like a Hefeweizen yeast, basically. So you pick up a lot of the banana and the clove and stuff like that. I know you're not a big clove fan, Marshall. So, but this was actually really well done, and it was something that made me think about, maybe I should brew this one day, because it was quite enjoyable.
Yeah. I'm glad you liked it. I know there are a lot of people out there who enjoy, classic Bavarian Hef, and I'll drink it. It's not something I want to have 5 gallons on tap. Now,
right.
The focus of the experiment we're going to talk about in the next segment was on the impact rye has in an American pale ale. If you go and you hit the internet for beers with rye in it, you're going to find a bunch of IPA and pale ale. There's just something about the use of rye in these hoppy styles that people really seem to enjoy. Why, Steve, would you opt to use flaked rye or malted rye in an American pale ale?
I've looked at this actually from many different people talking about and writing about, whether it be on like message boards or whatever, or social media, and they talk about the pairing of a rye beer or a beer with rye and a certain hops. And surprisingly enough, this actually rye really does well with Mosaic, I've read. And I don't know who I can credit that with, or whatnot, but I've had it myself. Actually, this beer that I did the experiment for had Mosaic in it. And I loved it. And I think it's the perceived sweetness that you get from either rye malt or flaked rye that can just kind of marries really well with the sweetness from Mosaic hops. And at least that's how I'm perceiving it. I love it. I think it's a match made in heaven. It's basically taking 2 ingredients that I'm very fond of, both rye and Mosaic hops, and kind of, mashing them together. No pun intended. So it's definitely something that I like.
Yeah, so I think you kind of hit on something there that I wasn't going to say with as eloquently as you did, but this idea that the impact of rye, there's this gestalt that I experience when I've used rye in hoppy beers, where it's interesting because yes, it absolutely contributes, in my opinion, a very noticeable increase in body, a slicker, thicker mouthfeel that is very pleasant, and in many ways, it's a great way to make up for what could ultimately be a thinner bodied beer. So, for example, let's say you're making a low ABV, session IPA or a session pale ale, something really low in ABV. One of the difficulties with that style is ensuring that you have that nice balanced, mouthfeel and body. And rye can be a good way to complement that style of beer so that that's not a distraction. That thinness doesn't become a distraction. But I think a part of that thickness that you get, that viscosity that you get from rye, also sends this interesting message that, this is sweeter. It's almost like that thickness holds on to the hop sweetness in a way to where it makes it shine just a little bit more, know? And to me, that is why I love rye in hoppy beers. I've got one of our Patreon recipes that we've given to patrons of Brewlosophy is Rudzu Alus. Rudzu is Latvian for rye, and Alus is beer. And so it's this rye beer, but it's really just a really pale yellow American pale ale with a bunch of rye in it that is absolutely delicious.
That sounds wonderful.
That was one of those beers. Oh, it's so good. It's one of those beers that pretty much everyone I shared it with was like, what is different about this? And honestly, the recipe is no different than other pale ales I've made, except for I swapped in, I think, 25 or 30% rye malt. I would imagine, we're going to do the comparison that Flaked Rye maybe would contribute the same body and mouthfeel characteristics with a slightly more mild flavor. But like I said earlier, I have quite a bit of experience making beers with various portions of rye in them. Though I've always used malted rye and cannot recall a time I've ever opted for Flaked Rye. Steve, you were interested to see what, if any, differences would be perceived between an American pale ale made with Flaked Rye from one made with malted rye, and you put it to the test. We're going to be going over those results when we're back from this break. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to DEWHVACTrainingSC.com to inquire.
Barley may be the standard brewing grain, but rye has been used to make beer for probably the same amount of time, so I definitely view it as a staple brewing ingredient. Like barley, it comes in various forms. Does rye malt contribute different characteristics than flaked rye? That's exactly what you aim to find out in a recent experiment, Steve.
Yeah, so I took this to the test, and I used rye malt and flaked rye in an American pale ale, like we said. Used my brew in a bag setup. It had two 5-gallon batches going on simultaneously. My recipe was fairly basic. Pilsner malts like at 80%, and either malted rye or flaked rye at 20%. I made the conscious decision to really make sure that both ryes were of equal proportion, just so that it wouldn't be perceived as, if you didn't get as much rye notes in one, that's because you didn't add as much as the other one, right? So just kind of doing, the basic, everything is equal idea, which I thought worked out pretty well.
So earlier we talked about how, people, the recommended usage rates hover around they kind of top out at around 40% unless you're making Rogan beer. I know people can do whatever they want, but again, these are recommended from the maltsters around upwards of 40%. You went with 20% here. Like I said earlier, in my review of a bunch of rye recipes, rye, pale ale, and IPA recipes on Brewfather, that 20% seems to be fairly standard. So I personally thought that was a good place to at least start. Right. And again, reminder, this is not a rye versus no rye experiment. This is, does malted rye have a different, impart beer different, or impact beer differently than flaked rye? So 20% to me seemed like a pretty good way to go.
Yeah, it's a starting point, like you said. I would be interested in seeing if we can bump that up a little bit, just because I like rye that much. It's that note of something that's different in your beer that makes you stop and think, oh, what is that? So it's just that type of an ingredient. It has that much power in my eyes for a beer.
Yeah, agreed.
So back to the recipe, my brewing process. I mashed both beers at 154 Fahrenheit. That is 68 C. And when mash rusts were completed, I removed the grains and I squeezed the bags, and then went on to start my boil. Mashed for the normal 60 minutes. Boil was for 60 minutes as well. Like I alluded to before, the hop of choice was Mosaic, because of all the research that I've read in the past that Mosaic has this really wonderful flavor characteristics that go really well with rye. So I really just wanted to use it, and that was the hop of choice. 14 grams at 60 minutes. And then another 14 grams of Mosaic at 10 minutes. And then at the 5-minute mark for both batches, I hit it with 28 grams. After the boil, the worts were chilled, racked into sanitized fermenters. At this point, I had a refractometer reading of 1.054 for both batches.
That's awesome. I mean, talk about consistency,
Right.
Both hitting 1054 just shows that what the part that interests me is that technically, from what I was reading, you wouldn't expect to get as good or as high of a specific gravity from flaked rye as you do from malted rye. But here, whatever you did, you got 1054 for both. So interesting for me to see that.
I don't think I've ever really had a struggle with using flaked ingredients and having lower numbers. At least it's never stood out to me, but it's something I should start, thinking about when I'm brewing with either flaked rye or flaked oats or whatever, flaked barley.
Yeah.
Because it's just an interesting concept, I think. So then I pitched my both batches with Imperial Yeast L05 cable car. Fermented both beers at 68 Fahrenheit, that is 20 C. After 2 weeks of fermentation, hydrometer readings measured at, for the malted rye, 1.013 final gravity, and for the flaked rye, 1.011 final gravity.
Okay, so that's not too big of a difference.
No.
2 specific gravity points at the finish. I would have expected the malted rye to be a little bit lower personally. But you started at the same 1054 OG. You ended with a fairly similar finishing gravity. So to my eyes, at least at this point, I'm assuming, all right, these beers, numbers wise, stats wise, are mostly the same. Offshoot. I am curious what your decision making process behind using cable car was. Now, for those who don't know what LO5 Imperial Yeast LO5 cable car is, that is their version of the Anchor Steam yeast. So it is technically a lager yeast, a lager strain that is commonly used or fermented at ale temperatures. Was it one of those, I just have it on hand, or were you actually going for something?
It was something that I wanted to try myself. This was I was fairly new to brewlosophy, and I had never really, doubted the whole idea that you can ferment warm. But I just I really wanted to try it myself, right? And here, cable car was readily available, and I figured, well, I should probably, at least give it a try. Not that there's doubt in my mind, but I can say, okay, I've tried this, and also variety, after a while you get kind of sick of just using the same old, and I'm glad I used it, and I'll use it again for sure.
Well, I'll tell you, I've used Cable Car a number of times on various styles of beer, more than just California Common, and I personally think it was a great choice. I love Cable Car and hoppy beers. It does this interesting thing where I almost feel like it also contributes to this really nice. I don't know. I don't want to call it rich because it's not sweet rich, but it makes the beer just feel more flavorful, if that makes sense. That's completely subjective. That's my own personal experience. I'm not making any claims of fact here, but I thought it was a good choice for this. So
it seems like it's something that goes along with this beer that I'm brewing, right? And that rye adds that extra, complexity, the extra richness to the beer itself that you would, want to have a yeast that kind of does the same thing, kind of complements it, if you will.
Yeah.
So then after taking the readings and after fermenting, I transferred both beers into CO2 purged kegs, and they were placed in my keezer and burst carbonated overnight, and they were conditioned for about a week before that was ready to serve to evaluators. The appearance of both beers were identical, very clear. This is actually one of the clearest beers I've ever made. And I did not use any gelatin at all. Just a very pale gold in color with a very stark white foam head, which was great.
Yeah.
And
a note on the clarity of this beer, Steve. I have noticed in my experience when using 15 north of 15% rye malt in beers that it has this weird quality of the beers tend to clear up really, really quickly, even if you don't use fining agents. And I don't know what explains that. Maybe it's just my personal experience. But when I remember seeing these experiment beers that you brewed and thinking, man, those sure are clear for a week in the keg,
Yeah.
And I don't know what, like I said, what contributes to that. I don't know if there's something about, rye malt that expedites the clarification process, if there's something in it. But it's to me, it was one of the initial reasons I'd made like a rye saison many, many years ago. Mm-hmm. Just a one-off kind of bored one Saturday morning, wanted a saison. I think I had some Belle Saison yeast laying around. And, saison, you kind of expect to be at least a little bit hazy. That's pretty normal.
Sure.
This beer cleared up immediately. And that was my first indicator. And then I made that Rudzo Alus, like I said earlier, and it was crystal clear about 5 days in the keg after kegging it. So I do wonder if there's not something about rye that contributes to, a faster clarification process. I really don't know.
I don't know either, but I can share your sentiment about the rye saison, and I've brewed one myself many years ago, and same thing. I was expecting it to be, really cloudy, and I remember actually going to Facebook and asking, this is when I was really young and didn't know hardly anything at all. I still don't, but thinking, this is, should it be clear? Should it be hazy? I don't know. And I remember somebody just mentioning, if there's a little bit of haze, it's not that bad, which was really this rye saison was much like the beer that I did the experiment for.
Yeah, nice and clear.
Right.
Has that. Now, the only thing that I could come to is that I'm pretty certain that there's some polyphenols that are in barley husks, and having a huskless grain in there is going to reduce the amount of haze causing polyphenols, perhaps. I don't know if that's the reason why, but that's kind of what I told myself years ago. Anyways, the beer, these experiment beers were quite clear for being in the keg for just a week.
Yeah.
This was an American pale ale, so we wanted to serve it fresh to tasters, so that it wasn't a stale ale, if you will.
Definitely. So my impressions of this beer for the triangle test that I've conducted myself, the semi-blind, even though I was privy to what the experiment was, it was still done with my back turned, and my wife was pouring beers and everything, and I actually was correct 4 out of the 5 times, which is really interesting.
Impressive.
Well, yeah. and it's just it was this perceived subtle sweetness that I got from the Flaked Rye batch. And even in preparing this morning for this podcast, I was actually stumbling upon this perceived sweetness in rye malt. So I'm like, that's the exact opposite of what I actually perceived. So I don't know. It was weird. I enjoyed both beers quite extensively. Both those kegs did not last very long, and I think I prefer using rye malt over flaked. But just because of the fact that I have it readily available, much like we were starting earlier on when talking about the group buys, I went ahead and split a 55-pound bag with a friend of mine years ago, and for a sack of rye, and I'm still using that. So it's there. I'm not gonna be difficult and insist that I have something else. But yeah, I would use both. I wouldn't scoff at either rye malt or flaked rye. But it was just an interesting discovery that the flaked rye had that sweetness.
Yeah, and the thing to keep in mind is that 4 out of 5 is not perfect, but boy is it consistent. And that happens every once in a while where we're able to kind of perceive these differences. And it speaks to this, in my opinion, it speaks to the subjectivity of everybody's palate and certain sensitivities that people might have. And it's possible that you are just sensitive to this. Now, obviously, we have not shared the results of the experiment. You ended up serving these beers to 20 participants who were completely blind to the variable. So unlike you, they had no idea what the difference between these beers were. Out of those 20, 11 would have had to identify the unique sample in the triangle test for us to say with some level of confidence that these beers were perceptibly different. And in the end, only 9 did. So, that is not significant. So this would suggest that the blind data kind of goes against your own personal experience,
right?
And would suggest that these beers were, on a perceptible level, more similar than they were different. I know people will not like that description of it, but that's how I tend to view it. But it's always interesting to me when the real data doesn't align with the subjective, your personal impressions and your experience, Steve. And again, it kind of solidifies this idea in my head that maybe if you had taken 20 blind Steves, who have your sensitivity to rye or whatever it is, that it would have been significant. And this is why using these ingredients on your own and determining for yourself is so important. And also not taking a single data point as gospel. It's just not the case. But here, again, out of 20 tasters, only 11 were able to identify the unique sample. And that's just not enough. I'm sorry, only 9. God, not even half. When we needed 11, that's just not enough to push us past that threshold of significance. I think it's really interesting.
It's interesting, and it kind of screams more experimentation, right?
Amen. Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Which I love because I love rye. So,
you just be the rye guy.
Yeah. Well, you know what? To be honest, and kind of an aside here, I spent many hours last night thinking about a recipe, kind of blending my two obsessions of rye beer and spruce tips. So I spent a good portion of the evening trying to sleep and kept on getting interrupted with thoughts of a spruce tip rye beer. So it's in my head somewhere. I'm kind of going through the process right now. So I don't know, maybe something I can play with.
I mean, again, I've never used spruce tips and I've never used flaked rye. And so you could make a beer that I've never even come close to making before. But when I think about what I learned from you that spruce tips contribute to beer and what I know of rye to contribute to beer, it actually sounds like it would work really well. So I think that's
what I'm thinking.
Yeah, perfect for a brew it yourself in the future. But ultimately what we can say about this specific experiment that you performed is that at a usage rate of 20% in an American Pale Ale hop hopped entirely with Mosaic, which I think was a beautiful decision. Tasters were unable to consistently tell the beers apart, even though you could. We can't say again with any confidence that Flaked Rye is going to impart any, characteristic difference noticeable at this usage rate in a pale ale versus malted rye. And I think that's interesting. Now, we do have some reader comments I think we should get to, just a couple here. The first one comes from Olivier, who says, "Thank you for this experiment. Having used both, I was pretty sure my beers made with malted rye were, quote, better than those incorporating the flakes, which makes me think it was bias. Anyway, I like rye wherever it is. I opened a Rogan beer yesterday that I brewed a year and a half ago, and it is still damn good. If lautering wasn't such a difficulty, I would use rye and much more brewing sessions."
Brew in a bag, brother. Brew in a bag.
I was waiting for that, Steve.
Yeah. You know what? I will go to my grave knowing that brew in a bag is the way to go. Call it bias. That's fine. I know I am. But yeah, I mean, a Rogan beer a year and a half later, that's pretty outstanding, I think. So,
I've wondered about when I think about beers that don't do well with age, it's typically really light, pale lagers or even a Vienna lager that after time that maltiness just kind of overtakes there's like this malt sweetness, or obviously hoppy beers. The hops fall out. We know that.
Sure.
Hefeweizen, Rogan beer, more yeast character beers, higher yeast character. Some of the best, like Belgian quads I've ever had have been like 6 years old. And so it makes sense to me that a Rogan beer would do really well with some age on it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure to the extent the rye contributes to that, but maybe it does. Who knows,
maybe.
Olivier? And I'm glad you enjoyed that year and a half old Rogan beer, and that you're a rye user like us. We love it as well.
Yes.
Next comment comes from Joe. He says, "Interesting that you perceived the Flaked Rye beer as being slightly sweeter, even though it had a lower FG, and thus presumably less residual sugars. Another data point for the suggestion that lower attenuation does not necessarily equal sweeter." I had to include this because we've done a lot of experiments on mash temperature in particular, where one beer finishes way higher specific gravity than the other, and yet people still can't tell them apart. It really does seem like, whatever it was in this experiment, Steve, that contributed to the Flaked Rye beer having a lower FG than the malted rye beer, I don't know. But the fact that it wasn't sweeter, again, really does seem to support this idea that the residual sugars in beers with higher FG may not necessarily be perceptibly sweet, which I find fascinating.
And I wonder also, and I agree with you, it is fascinating. And I wonder also, is it the sweetness that we are perceiving from the hops as well? Even though this beer wasn't really hoppy, there's only 2 ounces of beers or of hops total. I don't know. Maybe that was just that perception of that sweetness from the Mosaic hop. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Yeah, and Mosaic is definitely a hop variety that I perceive as being sweeter, as imparting kind of a sweeter character to it. And so maybe that, maybe a different hop would make a difference. Again, you can't just take this single data point and use it, rest on it to make all of your decisions in the future. This is just one data point. But like you said, Steve, I absolutely look forward to further experiments with different forms of rye and different forms of flaked grains in general to see how they impact beer. So I think that's about all the time we've got on using Flaked Rye in an American Pale Ale. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
I mean, we just touched on it now. We don't have all the answers here, but at the same time, we do have experiments to fall back on, and we have the ability to keep on experimenting, which makes it even more interesting and more fun. So I'm going to keep on brewing these rye beers, and hopefully they turn out good. And we'll keep on talking about them.
Absolutely. Go use some rye. I think you'll appreciate it just as much as we do. And don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Kay Jobe takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to dewhvactrainingsc.com to inquire.